I was standing in my mother-in-law's dining room, surrounded by crystal glasses and people in pressed suits. When my sister-in-law Jessica lifted her champagne and laughed at me like I was a punchline, asking if my cute little freelance job finally paid enough to cover rent. And when a few people chuckled under their breath, she leaned in further and said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, I mean, some of us actually have real careers. And no one stopped her, not my husband, not his parents, not even the aunt who had just been praising family unity 5 minutes earlier, and I stood there holding my glass, feeling 30 pairs of eyes measuring my worth in silence, realizing in that exact moment that I had never been seen as part of this family, only tolerated, only explained away, only kept at the edge of every room. And the worst part was not what she said, it was how easily everyone accepted it as truth. Like they had all agreed on who I was long before I ever had a chance to speak. And if you've ever been in a room where people decided your value without asking you, you already know what that feels like. And before I go any further, if this story truly resonates with you, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if it speaks to your heart, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always read them, and it reminds me how many of us have lived through something like this. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and that night, standing in that dining room, was the moment everything in my marriage and my husband's family changed forever. But to understand why I didn't defend myself, why I didn't say a single word while she humiliated me in front of everyone, you need to go back to where it really started. Because Jessica didn't wake up that night and decide to laugh at me. She had been building to that moment for years. And the truth is, she thought she knew exactly who I was. They all did. They thought I was the quiet one, the one who worked from home, the one who didn't contribute in ways they could measure, the one who needed Daniel more than he needed me. And I let them believe it. Every single time they made a comment, every time they asked what I actually did all day, every time they compared me to Jessica and her law firm and her 6-figure salary, I stayed quiet, not because I didn't have an answer, but because the answer was something I had been protecting for a very long time, something tied to a contract none of them even knew existed. And that night, while Jessica was smiling like she had already won, someone at the end of the table quietly said, "Before we wrap up, we should go over the agreement." And the lawyer reached into his briefcase. And for the first time, I saw Jessica's attention shift, just slightly, like something in the room had changed. And that was the moment I knew. They were about to find out who I really was, just not in the way they expected. I met Daniel Carter on a quiet Tuesday afternoon at a small coffee shop in Cambridge, the kind of place where people sit for hours with laptops and no one asks you to leave. And he noticed me before I noticed him. Or at least that is what he told me later, that I looked focused, like I had somewhere to be even while I was sitting still. And at the time, I thought that meant something. I thought he saw something in me that other people did not. But what I did not understand back then was that seeing me and understanding me were two very different things. And the first time I met his family, I should have known exactly where I stood, because Jessica was already there, sitting at the head of the table like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. And when Daniel introduced me, she smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes and said, "Oh, you are the freelancer." Like that single word explained everything about me. Like it reduced me to something temporary, something unstable, something not quite real. And I laughed it off because that is what you do when you are trying to fit into a room that was never built for you. And his mother, Patricia, poured me a glass of wine without asking what I liked. And his father asked me what I did in a tone that sounded polite but felt like an evaluation. And when I explained my work, carefully, simply, trying not to sound defensive, Jessica nodded slowly and said, "So you do not have a company, or a title, or a team?" And I said no, not in the way she meant. And she leaned back in her chair and said, "That must be nice, not having real pressure." And everyone laughed softly, not cruelly, not loudly, but enough that I understood this was not a one-time comment. This was a pattern, and over the next 2 years, it repeated itself in small ways that added up to something much heavier. Thanksgiving dinners where Jessica would talk about her clients and then glance at me and say, "I cannot imagine working without structure." Christmas mornings where gifts were exchanged and Daniel got a leather briefcase, Jessica got a designer watch, and I got a cookbook because you work from home, you must have time. Birthday dinners, where someone would ask what I had been working on, and before I could answer, Jessica would say, "Oh, Emily just does her online thing," and the conversation would move on. And I told myself it did not matter, that I did not need their validation, that I was building something that did not need to be explained to people who had already decided not to understand it. But the truth is, it did matter, not because of what they thought, but because Daniel never corrected them. Not once, not when his sister minimized my work, not when his parents treated it like a hobby, not when I was reduced to a sentence that fit comfortably into their version of me. And I remember one night, about a year into our marriage, sitting on the edge of our bed after another dinner where Jessica had made a comment about real careers, and I asked him, quietly, "Why do you not say anything?" And he hesitated just long enough for me to understand the answer before he said it. "They just do not get it. It is easier to let it go." And that was the moment something shifted for me, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, something settled into place, something quiet and firm. And the next morning, I woke up, opened my laptop, and replied to an email that I had been thinking about for weeks, a message from a firm that did not care about titles or appearances, only results, and I said yes to a project that would take 3 years to build, 3 years of silence, 3 years of letting everyone believe exactly what they wanted to believe about me, because by then, I had already decided that when the time came, I would not need to explain anything at all. The first real crack did not come from a loud argument or a dramatic scene. It came from a quiet message I was never meant to see, a forwarded email that landed in my inbox by mistake late one Friday night while I was still working. And at first I almost ignored it because it came from Daniel's father, addressed to a business contact, but my name was in the subject line, so I opened it, and there it was in plain text. A sentence that did not feel like a misunderstanding, not even close. "Emily does not have the capacity to handle anything complex, so we will proceed without her involvement." And I sat there staring at the screen, reading it again and again, because that sentence did not come out of nowhere. It came from somewhere. It came from someone who had told them that about me, and I did not need long to figure out who, because the wording felt familiar, too familiar. Like something I had heard before, softened, repackaged, but always there. And the next morning at brunch, Jessica was already talking about a new deal her firm was negotiating, something tied to a partnership expansion, something she described in detail while glancing at me every now and then like she was measuring my reaction. And at one point she laughed and said, "It is a little complicated, not really your world." And that was when it clicked. Not just a suspicion, but a clear line connecting everything. And later that afternoon, when Daniel stepped out to take a call, I picked up his phone without thinking, not to invade his privacy, but because a notification had flashed across the screen with my name in it, and there it was. A message thread between him and Jessica, weeks long, detailed, deliberate. And I scrolled slowly, my hands steady in a way that surprised me, reading lines that felt like someone else's story until I realized they were not. "She would not understand the structure," Jessica had written. And Daniel replied, "It is easier if you just explain it to them without involving her." And there were more messages, small adjustments, quiet agreements, ways to position me as uninvolved, as incapable, as irrelevant, and none of it was loud. None of it was cruel in the obvious way, but it was consistent, careful, and effective. Because by the time it reached his parents, it was no longer a suggestion, it was a fact, something everyone repeated without questioning. And I put the phone down exactly where I found it, not because I forgave it, but because I understood it, and that understanding changed something in me. Because I realized I had not just been underestimated, I had been actively rewritten into someone smaller, someone easier to dismiss. And the worst part was not that Jessica believed it. It was that Daniel had allowed it to happen, quietly, repeatedly, until it became the version of me that everyone accepted, And that night, when we sat across from each other at dinner, he asked if everything was okay, and I said yes, because I was not ready to explain something he had already chosen not to see, and instead I went back to my work, back to the project I had said yes to months earlier, the one that required long hours and silence and precision. The one tied to a contract that was still being drafted, still being negotiated, still far enough away that no one in that family would connect it to me, and for weeks after that, nothing changed on the surface. Jessica still made her comments, his parents still nodded along, Daniel still chose the easier path, and I let it all continue, not because I was weak, but because I was waiting. And then one afternoon, about 3 months before that dinner, I received a call from a number I recognized immediately, and when I answered, the voice on the other end said, "We are ready to finalize the agreement, but we need you present for the signing." And I looked at the calendar, at the date, at the location, and for the first time, I saw exactly how everything was about to collide, because the signing was not happening in a boardroom or an office. It was happening at Daniel's parents' house, during a family gathering. And that was the moment I realized that when the truth came out, it would not just correct a misunderstanding, it would expose everything they had built on top of it, and there would be no way to take it back. The next morning, I tried to fix something that was already broken in ways I could not yet fully name, and I started small, because that is what you do when you still believe things can be repaired. I sent Jessica a message. Simple, careful, "Hey, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about my work. I would appreciate if we could clear it up." And I watched the screen for a reply that never came, not that day, not the next, not even a week later. And I told myself she was busy, that it was not intentional. But the silence felt deliberate, like a decision rather than an oversight. And then I tried Daniel, not with accusations, just questions. I asked him over dinner if he had ever explained what I actually did to his family, and he hesitated again. The same pause I had learned to recognize, and said, "They would not really get it anyway, it is complicated." And I remember nodding like that made sense, even though it did not. Because what he was really saying was that I was not worth the effort of being understood, and that realization stayed with me longer than anything Jessica had ever said, and still, I kept trying. I drafted an email to his parents, not emotional, not defensive, just factual, explaining my role, the projects I was handling, the clients I worked with. I even attached a summary document, something I had never shown anyone outside my work, and I read it 3 times before sending it, making sure every sentence was clear, calm, impossible to dismiss. And when the reply came 2 days later, it was a single paragraph from Patricia, polite, distant. "Thank you for sharing. Emily, we are glad you are keeping busy." And that was it, no questions, no acknowledgement, just a soft dismissal wrapped in courtesy, and I sat there staring at the words, "keeping busy," realizing that in their minds, nothing had changed, not because they had not been given the truth, but because they had already chosen not to accept it. And the calls I made after that went the same way, short conversations, deflections, subtle redirections back to Jessica's work, Jessica's achievements, Jessica's importance, and each time I hung up, the space between me and that family felt wider, quieter, more permanent, until eventually I stopped calling, not out of anger, but because I ran out of ways to say the same thing to people who were not listening. And the isolation did not come all at once. It came in small absences, invitations that stopped arriving, group messages where my name was no longer included, conversations I would hear about later as if I had simply been forgotten. And Daniel noticed. I think he did, but instead of confronting it, he adjusted to it, like it was easier to let me drift to the edges than to pull me back in. And one night, sitting alone in our living room while he stayed late at work again, I opened my laptop, not to write another explanation, not to fix anything, but to review the contract I had been working on for months, the one that required my full attention, my full clarity, my full presence. And for the first time, I read it not as something separate from my life, but as something that was about to intersect with it in a way none of them expected. And that was when something finally shifted, not in them, not in the situation, but in me. Because I realized I had been asking for permission to be seen by people who had already decided to look away, and I closed the laptop slowly, took a breath, and made a decision I had been avoiding for far too long. I was done explaining, done asking. Done trying to earn a place in a room that had never made space for me, and from that point on, I stopped reaching out entirely. I stopped correcting them. I stopped defending myself, and instead, I focused on the one thing that did not depend on their approval, the work I had built quietly, steadily, without them, because I knew, whether they realized it or not, everything they believed about me was about to be tested, and this time, I was not going to say a single word before the truth spoke for itself. The first thing I did was change where I worked, not because I needed a new place, but because I needed distance from the version of me they thought they knew. So I moved from the kitchen table in our apartment to a small office space downtown, nothing flashy, just a quiet building with glass doors and a receptionist, who asked for my name the first time I walked in and then remembered it the second, and I remember the feeling of hearing, "Good morning, Emily," from someone who had no reason to underestimate me, and inside that space, everything was different, not easier, but clearer. My days were structured around calls, contracts, deadlines that actually mattered, not to prove anything to anyone, but because the work itself demanded it, and the project I had said yes to months earlier slowly took shape, piece by piece, meeting by meeting. I sat across from people who did not ask what I did. They already knew. They had read my proposals, reviewed my analysis, signed off on decisions I had made, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I had to explain my value. It was already built into the room, and there was one moment I kept coming back to, a small one. But it stayed with me, the day the finalized contract draft arrived in my inbox with my name printed at the top, not buried in a list, not mentioned in passing, but clearly, formally, Lead Strategic Consultant, Emily Carter. And I stared at those words longer than I expected, not because they surprised me, but because of how quietly I had earned them. 3 years of work that no one in that family had ever asked about. 3 years of being dismissed while building something that did not need their recognition to exist. And I printed that page, not to show anyone, just to hold it in my hands, to remind myself that the version of me they believed in was never the full story. And over time, the gap between those two versions grew wider, not in a way that felt dramatic, but in a way that felt steady, grounded, like I was finally standing in a place that did not shift under other people's opinions. And Daniel noticed the change. I think he did. He asked once why I was spending more time at the office, why I seemed more focused, and I told him the truth, that I was working on something important, and he nodded, like he accepted that answer, but he never asked what it was. Never pushed past the surface, and that told me everything I needed to know about where we stood. And as the months passed, the final pieces of the agreement came together, revisions, signatures, confirmations, until there was only one step left. The formal reading and execution, and when the date was set, I saw it immediately. The location listed in the email, Daniel's parents' house. The same dining room where I had stood so many times before, listening, smiling, staying quiet. And I did not react, not outwardly. I just replied, confirmed, and closed my laptop. Because by then, everything was already in motion, and the night of that dinner, when Jessica raised her glass and laughed, when the room tilted slightly in her favor like it always had, I did exactly what I had trained myself to do for years. I stayed still. I said nothing, and I let her have that moment, because I knew something she did not, something none of them did, that the same table they used to measure my worth was about to become the place where the truth would be read out loud, line by line, with my name exactly where it had always belonged. In the weeks after that night, nothing exploded the way people imagine it would. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, just a quiet shift that settled into everything, like the air had changed and everyone could feel it, but no one knew how to name it. Jessica stopped making comments, not because she apologized, but because she did not know where to place me anymore. And that uncertainty said more than anything she could have said out loud. Daniel tried, in his own way, small conversations, careful questions, but something between us had already been exposed in that room. Something that could not be undone with a few words after years of silence. And I did not fight him. I did not argue. I simply stepped back from the version of our life that required me to shrink in order to stay, and for the first time, I chose something different. Not louder, not harsher, just clearer. I moved into my own apartment a few months later. A small place with a window that faced east, where the morning light came in slowly, steady, predictable. And I remember the first morning I sat there with a cup of coffee, no noise, no expectations, no one deciding who I was supposed to be, just me. And it felt unfamiliar at first. Then it felt right, not perfect, not easy, but honest. And the contract that had once been a secret became just another part of my work, something I no longer needed to hold onto as proof. Because I had already seen what it revealed, not about them, but about me. And if there is one thing I learned from all of this, it is that people will often accept the simplest version of you, the one that fits their comfort, their expectations, their control. And if you spend too long trying to correct them, you can lose the energy you need to build your own life. So now, I do not rush to explain myself. I do not chase understanding from people who have already decided not to see me. I pay attention to my instincts, to that quiet voice that told me something was wrong long before I had proof, and I protect my time, my work, my peace, because those things are not meant to be negotiated with anyone who does not respect them. And if you are listening to this, and you have ever felt like you had to prove your worth in a room that only saw you one way, I want you to know that you are allowed to step out of that room. You are allowed to build something without their approval. And sometimes, the universe, or God, or whatever you believe in, will place you exactly where the truth cannot be ignored, not for revenge, but for clarity, so you can finally see what was always there and choose differently. Thank you for being here with me, for listening, for staying through this story. It means more than you know. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave you with is this. Do not let anyone else define the size of your life. And if this story stayed with you in any way, feel free to share where you are watching from and what time it is for you. And if you want to hear more stories like this, there are others waiting for you. Different lives, different moments, but the same quiet truth that sometimes the most important thing you can do is choose yourself and keep going.